have cancer, but my boyfriend doesn't know. He once gave up his dream university for me. He also rushed to another woman at a car accident scene, leaving me injured behind. I died on the day he was setting off fireworks abroad with his female secretary. On the day I found out there was a tumor in my brain, Lucas proposed to me. My mind was in chaos. For a moment, I suspected he knew everything. After hesitating for less than 30 seconds, he stood up from the ground, put the ring box back in his pocket, and glanced at me with an indifferent look. It's my parents' request. If you don't agree, forget it. I felt a sense of relief. As expected, he was always fond of joking with me. I guess this time he also thought I was using his parents to pressure him into marriage. So he came up with this proposal to humiliate me. I silently put down my outstretched hand and smiled at him. What if I agree? Will you marry me? He looked at me without saying a word. The answer couldn't be clearer. To be honest, it was quite hurtful. If you don't marry me now, you might not have the chance in the future, I said huffily, suppressing the heat in my eyes. Lucas was unfazed. He took off his jacket and placed it on the back of the sofa, with a hint of sarcasm at the corner of his mouth. Are you sure that day will come? He was always prophetic. Indeed, I wouldn't live to see that day. At night, I sat on the bed, lost in thought. Lucas closed his laptop, closed his eyes to relieve his sore eyes for a moment, then got up and lifted the covers to get into bed. He habitually turned his back to me, leaving enough space between us to fit a pillow. Sleeping posture never lies. We've been together for 8 years, yet he still can't get used to sleeping in the same bed with me. I've always been thick-skinned in front of him. Even if he's unwilling, I would sneak over when he's asleep, press tightly against his back, and hug his waist. Even our first time was something I begged for shamelessly. At that time, I was 20 years old. I vaguely remember it was raining heavily that day. The dense raindrops pattered against the window panes, and the air was cold and damp. I took off my little jacket and slowly walked towards him, hugged him, and he stood still without moving. The waist under a man's white shirt was so thin and narrow. Unlike me, his body temperature was very high. I was trembling all over with shame, thinking that if he rejected me, I might just want to die. I looked up and smiled at him with all my might, but tears blurred my vision. At that time, I was so afraid of hearing words like shameless, cheap, or disgusting from his mouth. After all, I was still a young girl, with mindless courage, but no ability to bear the consequences. He looked at me coldly, as if he would push me away the next moment. I fumbled with his buttons with shaking hands, my legs trembling so much I could barely stand. What are you doing? He asked. I stammered, unable to speak. He lowered his head and kissed me, with a bitter taste mixed with tears. You don't even know how to seduce someone. Silly. I smelled a faint scent of alcohol. His girlfriend had moved on to someone else, and he was in a bad mood. I took advantage of the situation, and from then on, he had a piece of flypaper he couldn't shake off. In the pitch darkness, I stared at the vague outline of the chandelier on the ceiling. Perhaps when death is approaching, one's mindset becomes more peaceful. The person I once wasted my youth chasing after, the feelings I once tore my heart out for, now seem less important than whether I can see tomorrow's sunrise. When I woke up the next morning, the early sunlight fell on my face, causing me to feel a bit confused. The doctor said the tumor might be pressing on my optic nerve, so it takes me a while to focus when I look at things now. Lucas was leaning against the headboard, reading a financial magazine. In the past, when we lazed in bed together on weekends, I would cling to him like a koala, with at least one of my limbs on his body. This was an unconscious reaction of my body. Lucas looked down. Awake? I smiled at him. Good morning. He glanced at my shoulder, with an indecipherable look. You slept quite obediently last night. I still smiled. He suddenly frowned slightly. What nonsense were you talking about in your dream just now? I touched my face. It was wet. Did I cry? Worried that he would delve deeper, I sat up halfway and looked at him seriously. I dreamed that I went to Norway and saw snow and the northern lights. I really want to go. Can we? I looked at him pleadingly, with a hint of begging. Lucas ignored me. No time. I opened my mouth, then slowly smiled. All right then. Perhaps my reaction was too calm. He turned his head and looked at me for a while, then said indifferently, how about next March? I can't make time this year. I nodded. We should still have time. Actually, I dreamed of 12-year-old Lucas. He wasn't like this before. He used to be a very good brother. I was born picky with food, disliking this and that, but afraid of being scolded by adults. He could eat what I left without any disgust. Unlike now, when he won't touch a water glass I've drunk from. When I was bullied at school, had my hair pulled, and my homework scribbled on, he was always the first to stand up for me, beating up those annoying boys, explaining to the teachers for me, and giving me his new notebooks. I was very introverted as a child, and from a single-parent family. Without his protection, I probably would have been severely bullied. Later, when my mom died, I cried until I nearly fainted. I said, no one wants me anymore. He said, that's not true. I repeated, and he repeated. I sat on the ground crying all night, and he comforted me all night, despite his toothache. The next day, his whole cheek was swollen. After that, I told him I liked him and threw myself at him half naked. His face was cold. He said I was being cheap. On Monday at work, Lucas left his spare phone at home, so I went to his company to deliver it to him. On the way, someone called. I looked at the contact name, ZZ. How intimate. All these years, he has only ever called me by my full name, Vivian. When my mom named me, she probably hoped I would live a peaceful and worry-free life. Regrettably, I got brain cancer before turning 30, failing to live up to her expectations. Come to think of it, my family has a history of tumors. My mom, my aunt, and my great-grandmother all died of cancer, and they all passed away very young. When I arrived at the company, Zoe stopped me, distant but polite. The CEO is in a meeting. Please wait for a moment. Zoe was his university classmate and became his secretary after graduation. She handles all of Lucas's affairs, big and small. The two of them spend more time together every day than I do with Lucas. What bothers me is that they dated briefly during university. Although it wasn't for long, it has always been a thorn in my heart. In Lucas and my shared social circle, everyone thinks I'm willful and possessive in front of him, not allowing any girl to get close to him. But I don't dare to even suggest firing Zoe. I still vividly remember how reluctant Lucas was to break up with Zoe. At that time, Lucas was utterly dejected, looking at me coldly with with an expression I had never seen before. "Do you only know how to use my parents to force me?" His voice was hoarse, and I even thought I saw tears in his eyes. Did he like her that much? That time, I was stunned for a long while. He's usually so reserved. I had never seen him care about someone so much before. In the past, I might have thrown a tantrum, waiting until the meeting was over to see Lucas come out, then deliberately show affection in front of Zoe. But this time, I handed the spare phone to Zoe, asking her to return it to Lucas after the meeting. I nodded slightly to her and turned to leave. There was a hint of surprise on Zoe's face. Lucas's parents moved back to their quiet old house after retirement. I go back to see them every month, but Lucas is reluctant to go. "My parents have always liked you more than me," he said casually while reading a contract. "You can go by yourself. My mom got pregnant before marriage, and I don't know who my father is." Lucas's mom and my mom were best friends. After my mom passed away, they raised me. I'm very grateful to them and have always tried to be well behaved. You could even say I was trying to please them. Pleasing aunt, pleasing uncle, pleasing Lucas. Lucas doesn't have a good relationship with his parents, and I'm a big part of the reason why. He doesn't know that I'm actually the one who's dependent on others. Back then, Lucas's parents didn't approve of him being with Zoe, because they found out Zoe was being kept by someone at that time. When the photographic evidence was presented to Lucas, he didn't care. "Zoe had her reasons," he said. "So aunt, exasperated, pointed at me. Rather than letting you go for those unsavory girls out there, why not choose Vivian? At least she's a pure and innocent girl." Lucas smiled faintly. "If you like her so much, why don't you marry her yourselves?" Snapping out of my memories, I coaxed him. "Let's go together. They'll be happier." Lucas's tone remained unchanged. "As long as you're happy." I gave in. After looking at him for a while, I got up and took my bag. "There's food in the kitchen. Remember to eat." He didn't look up. "Okay, be safe on the road. It takes a 3-hour drive to get to the old house." I'm good with words, and within a few sentences, I had the old couple laughing heartily. I helped Aunt loosen the soil and fertilize, sowed radish seeds, and set up frames for the pea shoots. I worked up quite a sweat and unknowingly fell asleep on the stone table in the vegetable garden. When I woke up, it was already dusk. Uncle's jacket was draped over me, and my arms had several mosquito bites. The sunset was as fierce as fire, carrying warmth. After dinner, it was time to leave. Aunt asked me to take good care of Lucas. I said I would. Uncle said, "Take care of yourself too. You look a bit haggard." Sometimes tears can be triggered by such a casual show of concern. I held back the lump in my throat and smiled. "I won't stay up late next time." On the way back, I realized that I probably couldn't drive alone anymore. The headaches were becoming more and more frequent. Ryan is my attending physician. He suggested I be hospitalized for treatment, as the frequency of headaches might increase in the later stages, and some people even experience persistent epilepsy. I shook my head. By that point, I would have probably taken my own life. "You know I can't stand suffering." He frowned at me for a while, and finally sighed. I didn't dare to drive, so he sent me home. On the way, Ryan looked at me through the rearview mirror. He still doesn't know. He, obviously referring to Lucas. I made a sound of agreement. I haven't figured out how to tell him yet. He was silent for a moment. I can hardly imagine his reaction. I laughed. He'd probably be relieved that he'll be free for the rest of his life. The biggest regret in Lucas's life must be touching me in his sophomore year. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been held responsible for me by both me and his parents. Ryan glanced at me and shook his head. "When I lied to him that you got drunk and agreed to be with me, and I happened to have your clothes from the night before on my arm, he misunderstood that something had happened between us and was furious." I said. He was angry because his parents were forcing him to break up with Zoe. Ryan clicked his tongue. "Whatever you say." The sky gradually darkened. As we passed by the sports square, a group of energetic young people were sweating it out on the basketball court. There was a moment of blankness in my eyes. "Stop for a bit," I said to Ryan. "I don't want to go back yet." "Don't you play basketball?" "I want to watch." "Me?" Ryan hesitated. "I play table tennis, but I haven't touched a basketball in years." After my soft persuasion, Ryan rolled up his sleeves and reluctantly joined the game. He's tall with long arms and legs, and after a bit of getting used to it, he didn't drag the team down. A beautiful three-pointer, and I couldn't help but cheer. Ryan wiped the sweat from his forehead and turned to look at me proudly. Not far away, I saw a familiar figure. He was wearing a shirt and trousers, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, looking at the basketball court with a bland expression. I knew that on the outside of his arm, there was a long, ugly scar that was left when he saved me in a car accident. A 20-centimeter wound, broken bones, steel pins. After that, due to nerve damage causing impaired finger movement, he could no longer play his favorite baseball or basketball. He couldn't even hold a glass of water steady.